As 88 gave way to 87, Sulla was gearing up for his campaign against Pontus, but before he could punish Mithridates, he had to get Roman politics back in order. As the outgoing consuls, he and Pompeius Rufus oversaw the elections for 87, and to prove to his opponents that he had no interest in monarchical power, he allowed people hostile to him to run for office. One such opponent was Lucius Cornelius Cinna, who ran for the consulship. He might have campaigned on the basis of prosecuting Sulla for his crimes against the Republic, and was positively predisposed to Marius, but Sulla did not rise to the challenge and let Cinna run regardless. Another candidate for that year was Gnaeus Octavius, an optimate previously in Sulla's camp who had gotten cold feet about his methods, and now distanced himself from the general. Sulla could not count on him to protect him from prosecution. The ballots were counted, and Cinna and Octavius were declared consuls for 87, showing that Sulla truly wanted to bring the Republic back to regular operation after the civil war. But there was a catch. Both men had to swear an oath that they would not overturn his reforms on the pain of banishment. With Sulla finally leaving his consulship, Rome let out a collective sigh of relief as he prepared to head east. Fortunately, the imperium he held as a military commander meant that he was protected from prosecution, but the same could not be said for his ally and friend Pompeius Rufus. So Sulla arranged for him to take command over the army stationed at Asculum, currently commanded by Pompey Strabo, the father of Pompey Magnus. This not only protected Rufus, but put a key Sullan ally in command of an army only a stone's throw away from Rome. But when Rufus turned up at the camp, he was jumped and murdered. While no hard evidence was found, it's extremely likely Strabo was involved. Sulla suddenly felt a lot less comfortable in Italy, and soon scuttled off to Capua with his tail between his legs. Understandably, Cinna did not have much time for oaths sworn to the man who conquered Rome, and immediately broke his, sending a tribune to accuse Sulla of murdering Roman civilians. Sulla told the tribune to talk to the hand, and continued to recruit troops. With one of his legions continuing the siege of Nola, Sulla moved the other 5 to Brundisium, the starting point for his Pontic campaign. He would leave Italy soon, but for all the time he was away, his enemies schemed against him and prepared for his return. But Sulla had bigger fish to fry. It's time to talk about Pontus. Originally a small mountainous kingdom on the fringe of Asia Minor, Pontus gradually crept over the Pontic Alps, and by the time Mithridates VI came to the throne in 120, it occupied much of the southern Black Sea coast. This region was fertile and wealthy, and would be the building block for Mithridates' mighty empire. He was just a boy when his father was poisoned and he ascended to the throne, but even at this age he held high hopes for his reign, and endeavoured to outdo his predecessors in every regard. So once he dealt with his enemies at court and solidified his rule, he embarked upon several rounds of conquest. The first of these was on the far side of the Black Sea, where the Greek colonists were being threatened by marauding Thracians and Scythians. He defeated them and earned the voluntary submission of Crimea and much of the northern Black Sea coast. This put Mithridates in total control of the Black Sea trade routes, and brought a vast amount of wealth to his empire, allowing him to field huge armies. Mithridates did not stop there though, and worked with Nicomedes III of Bithynia to partition the kingdoms of Asia Minor. Rome ordered them to desist, but the Republic was busy with Jugurtha and the Cimbri at that point, so they ignored the envoys. It was in 98, after Marius' disastrous 6th consulship, that Mithridates and Marius met while the latter was on his holiday in the east. While they spoke, Marius dished out some home truths to Mithridates. Either strive to be stronger than Rome, or do her bidding without a word. It would be a lesson Mithridates would take to heart. Then, as we've seen last episode, Sulla got involved in Asia Minor during his time as governor, installing Ariobarzanes as the king of Cappadocia. Mithridates soon recovered from this setback, and in 94, Nicomedes III of Bithynia died, leaving a boy king to rule, and then the Social War broke out in 91, leaving Rome's empire dangerously exposed to Mithridates. Mithridates shored up his position further by marrying his daughter to the powerful Tigranes II of Armenia. Then the two kings began their joint offensives. Tigranes invaded Cappadocia, while Mithridates took Bithynia. The two kings fled west to Rome, and begged the Senate for help, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Rome was already bogged down in the Social War, and didn't want to involve itself in yet another eastern conflict. The kings resorted to offering huge bribes for helping them return to their thrones, so the Senate finally acquiesced and sent a detachment under the command of Manius Aquilius to uphold Rome's rule in Asia Minor. Neither Mithridates nor Tigranes wished to square off with the Romans, so they both retreated and Aquilius reinstalled both kings on their thrones. Now that both kings had been installed on their thrones, all their promises of rich rewards turned into excuses and IOUs. Aquilius then began pressuring Nicomedes IV to invade Pontus and pay off his debt with war plunder. Aquilius had not been sent to Asia to needlessly pursue war with Pontus, and this was certainly not part of the Senate's plan, but Aquilius thought that Mithridates would simply capitulate, since every time Rome and Pontus had gone toe-to-toe so far, Mithridates had retreated. Another, more devious explanation is that Aquilius was purposefully starting a war against Pontus for Marius. You see, Aquilius had been one of Marius's proteges during the Cimbrian War, and may have been trying to secure a key command for his former master. Regardless of why, Aquilius had poked a bear that should have been left well alone. The Mithridatic War had begun. The Pontic forces were experienced and disciplined, making light work of the Bithynians before invading Cappadocia. Aquilius scrambled to raise troops and managed to squeeze 150,000 raw recruits out of Asia. But Mithridates was also marching and he had many grizzled men at his back. As soon as the Pontic forces encountered the Romans guarding the passes, the Romans melted away like summer snow and Mithridates ploughed through Asia. Further disasters followed when the Pontic navy passed through the Bosphorus and destroyed the Roman forces at sea. Just like that, Mithridates VI had conquered most of Anatolia, while Aquilius fled to Lesbos. The Pontic king knew how to make a good impression and proclaimed himself the liberator of the Greeks of Asia, while giving all cities a 5-year tax holiday, a welcome relief after the years of predatory Roman taxation. He then offered the people of Lesbos clemency if they handed over Aquilius. They complied and Aquilius became the prisoner of Mithridates. Aquilius was put to death a year later, supposedly by having molten gold poured down his throat. He then took up the cause as the champion of Greek freedoms, but for him it would be a pact that would be sealed in blood. Once the region was under his total dominion, he sent a letter to all cities of Asia Minor, telling them to wait 13 days from receiving the message and massacre every Italian or Roman they saw. Man, woman or child, it made no difference. In total, the so-called Asiatic Vespers led to the genocide of 80,000 Romans and Italians. But Mithridates did not use these drastic measures because of a sudden bout of barbaric cruelty. Instead, he was playing a far deeper game. The Romans would never forgive the massacre of their countrymen. Therefore, the cities of Asia Minor now had the choice of standing with Mithridates or total destruction. While the king stayed back to administer Anatolia, he ordered a two-pronged assault to liberate the peoples of Greece from Roman rule. An army of Thracians was dispatched in the north to assault Macedonia, while the more delicate task of securing Greece was given to Archelaus, Mithridates' favourite general. In early 87, his task force sailed to Athens, and with the assistance of the anti-Rome faction in Athens, he installed a man called Ariston as tyrant and incited Athens to revolt. Meanwhile in the north, the Thracian mercenary army pounded the few available legions under the command of a man called Sulla, and Rhodes was besieged by other Pontic forces. The situation was dire, and it was into these conditions that Sulla began his campaign. He landed in early 87 and began a march towards Athens. Archelaus did not try to block the movement of Sulla's forces, allowing the Romans to reach the walls of Athens unhindered. Sulla prepared to besiege the city, but was prevented from establishing an effective blockade by the Pontic control of the seas, so he dispatched his lieutenant, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, to travel to and petition other eastern kingdoms for naval support. But the mission would take time, so all Sulla's army could do was twiddle its thumbs while Sulla's enemies continued to act against him in Italy. Thankfully, the long walls of Athens had fallen into disrepair, so while Sulla was able to establish a fairly secure blockade of Athens, the port of Piraeus remained supplied by sea, and a few supplies even made it into Athens itself. Then the news reached him that Marius had returned to Italy, more on that next episode, as Cinna wrestled for control of the Republic. Unfortunately, Sulla could do nothing. He was completely committed to the Mithridatic War, and could not turn back now. As 87 gave way to 86, the siege dragged on, and Lucullus was nowhere to be seen. More worryingly still, Sulla's own wife and child eventually rocked up at his camp, driven from Rome by the Marian political persecutions. putting further pressure on Sulla to end the siege as quickly as possible, but the end was still nowhere in sight. Sulla's patience reached its end when some Athenian envoys preached at him to end the siege. While they were listing the many glories of the ancient city, Sulla suddenly snapped at the Athenians. "I was not sent to Athens by the Romans to learn of its history, but to subdue its rebels." His patience had snapped. It was time for a new course of action. In the dead of night, he ordered a few cohorts to sneak up a poorly defended section of wall. They entered the city undetected and soon opened the gates. As the Romans began to pour inside the city, they began a ruthless sack of Athens, looting, burning, raping, and tearing the city to pieces. With Athens taken, he set about storming the port of Piraeus, and soon enough had overwhelmed the Pontic forces and forced Archelaus' fleet to sea. Archelaus sailed north before disembarking in Thessaly and meeting up with reinforcements from Mithridates. Overall, the Pontic army now numbered 60,000. Sulla headed north to face him. The two armies met at Chaeronea, the same place Philip II had annihilated the armies of Athens and Thebes some 250 years earlier. And much like that earlier battle, this would also seal the fate of a free Greece. For Sulla inflicted a crushing defeat upon Archelaus, and the scattered remnants of the Pontic force fled back home. Good news began to filter in from Italy as well, for Marius had died in what has been rightly described as one of the all-time anticlimactic deaths of history. Despite his losses, Mithridates was not finished. With supreme effort, he was able to raise another huge army, this time consisting of 80,000 men, and sent them across the Aegean to meet Sulla's forces for a second time. At the time, Sulla was heading north to face a senatorial army under Valerius Flaccus, but as soon as Archelaus arrived, he doubled back and prepared to fight. The two armies met near the town of Orchomenus. The Romans brought 30,000 men to the fight, while Archelaus had roughly 80,000 and many scythed chariots. Understanding the danger of the Pontic superiority in numbers, and especially cavalry, Sulla's first move was to dig ditches on either flank of his army, and plant a thick wall of stakes hidden just behind his first line of infantry. Archelaus attempted to disrupt the works, but Sulla repulsed these attacks. The day of the main battle finally dawned. Archelaus placed his chariots in the front, massed his infantry in the centre, and put his cavalry on the flanks. The Pontic army began an all-out attack, but Sulla's preparations came good. The Pontic cavalry was bogged down by the trenches, while the scythed chariots were routed when Romans retreated behind the stakes and tossed their pila at them. The chariots fled and barreled straight into the Pontic phalanx, leaving it disordered and vulnerable. Sulla saw his moment and struck. The Romans charged forward, shattering the Pontic infantry and chasing them back to their camp, where they slaughtered the demoralised remnants. It had been another decisive victory, and this time Mithridates could not magic another army out of Asia. While he had sent the Pontics limping home, Sulla was now being threatened by his fellow Romans. The army under Valerius Flaccus crossed the Adriatic and raced to the Bosphorus to find and capture Mithridates while he was weak. Unfortunately for him, Flaccus was abruptly murdered in a mutiny by a man called Fimbria, who continued the mission and almost caught Mithridates. By this time, Lucullus finally returned with his fleet, but refused to work with Fimbria so that he wouldn't steal Sulla's thunder. Therefore Mithridates escaped, but he knew the game was up. He remembered Marius' advice from long ago and held a summit with Sulla at the ruined city of Dardanus. Sulla told Mithridates that he must relinquish all of his conquests, pay a crippling war indemnity, but beyond that, Mithridates got off lightly, considering his genocide of the Romans and Italians. The reason for Sulla's leniency was simple. He had no time. His enemies had once again taken total control of Rome, declared him a public enemy, and this time they had been raising armies to stop Sulla. He knew it wouldn't be a walkover like last time, and the longer he waited, the longer his enemies had to gather their troops. As a final punishment to the cities of Asia, he levied 5 years of back taxes to be paid immediately. Of course, the people didn't have that kind of money, so Sulla taxed the region by having his men plunder everything in sight. This, along with the money gained from Mithridates, would go to financing Sulla's campaigns in Italy. The East had been pacified, and it was time for Sulla to go home.